keep this incredible event going year after year. This is one of the signature events, cultural events here in Charlottesville. We are very fortunate. So as you get a chance to support, if you are able to do that, I really hope that you will do that. And if you like to support the festival, we have a very easy way to do that using one of the QR codes. And I'm not sure where the QR code is here, but we will find it later so that you can just flash your phone on it and give. And I'd like to give a special thanks to the Virginia Festival of the Book's premier sponsors, Michelle and David Baldacci. And Michelle and David are based here in Virginia. They are extraordinary philanthropists, and they are very active in support of literacy education here in the state of Virginia and beyond. So thank you to Michelle and David Baldacci. And I'd also like to thank the Anne and Jean Worrell Foundation, Dominion Energy, and the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation. Now, before we begin, I'd like all of us to please silence our phones. And I'd also like to encourage you to be aware of your space. Take a look around, see all available exits. In the case of an emergency, our site coordinator will be on hand to provide assistance. Site coordinator is, I'm not sure where our site coordinator, but we see the exits here, so I think we'll be good. Okay, there. Yes, okay. Site coordinator over here. And so, as always, if you see something, say something. And at the conclusion of our event, a bookseller will be on site to sell copies of Nick's book. And purchasing a book here through our local booksellers is a great way to support our authors. And Nick will be signing copies of his book after the event. And finally, we would like to note that festival authors and speakers represent themselves. They do not represent Virginia Humanities or the University of Virginia. And so, without further ado, I am delighted to welcome my friend Nicholas Boggs to the Virginia Festival of the Book. Now, Nick is the New York Times best-selling author of Baldwin, A Love Story. And this is the first major biography of this iconic figure in more than 3 decades. He also co-edited a new edition of Baldwin's collaboration with French artist Rory Kazak, Little Man, Little Man. A Story of Childhood, this is a 2018 book. He's the recipient of a 2023 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant and Fellowship from the Leon Levy Center for Biography, the Scholars in Residence Program at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Gilder Lehrman Center and Beinecke Library at Yale, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as residencies at Yaddo and McDowell. Most recently, he was the 2024 and 2025 John Hope Franklin Fellow at the National Humanities Center. He was born and raised in Washington, D.C., so we can almost claim you from down here. And he received his BA from Yale and his PhD from Columbia, both in English, as well as an MFA in creative writing from American University. And Nick now lives in New York City. So first of all, I just want to say, I picked up Nick's book in advance of this event. And I thought, okay, I'm going to read the first chapter, and then I'm going to skim the rest of the book and, kind of get the big idea of the book. Well, I read the first chapter, and then I read the second chapter, and read the third chapter. And I couldn't stop reading the book. I could not stop turning the pages of this book and, read it late into the night. It is a beautiful book. It's an immersive book. I love this book, and I am so glad to be in conversation with you today. My first question has to do with your title, which is Baldwin, A Love Story. And it seems to me, Nick, that the very first love story that we need to talk about is your love story with James Baldwin. So if you could just tell us, how did you learn about James Baldwin? How did you come to write this book? What was it about Baldwin, his life, his work that inspired you to produce this book?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Virginia Festival of the Book. And to be in conversation with one of my favorite writers and friends is just incredible. So thank you. I've been dreaming about this for a while, that someday we would do this. I also wrote a lot of this book in Virginia at the Virginia Center for Creative Arts. So I just want to give a shout out to that artist residency. Artist residencies, which we'll probably talk about, were also very important to Baldwin. Is this the right distance from my, okay. I don't want to yell at you guys. But how did I come to Baldwin? So I grew up in Washington, D.C., as you mentioned, the son of a civil rights attorney. My parents attended the March on Washington, and it was very important that we attend the D.C. public schools to them, where there were very few white students at the time. So in my 8th grade English class, lovely Mrs. Miles had a drawing of James Baldwin on the wall of her classroom. And I just remember his eyes and how intense they were. And I was so taken with them. But I reconnected with her after the book came out on the phone, and she said, Nick, you didn't just look at that picture. You came into the public school the next week wearing a suit and did a presentation on his whole life. So this was in the 8th grade. So I've actually been working on this book for 40-odd years. I nearly have, actually. But anyway, when I got to college, I borrowed my twin sister's copy of Giovanni's Room and read it in high school, sort of in secret. And then in college at Yale, I took a whole class on James Baldwin, the first class ever devoted to solely to his work. And we read everything Baldwin ever wrote, except this out-of-print children's book called Little Man, A Story of Childhood. And David Leeming's important biography came out in 1994, and there were 2 paragraphs about it. And so I wrote the second email of my life. This was 1996. To David Leeming saying, do you know anything else about this obscure French painter, Joran Kazak? He wrote me back a very nice email. He said, I never met him. I don't know anybody still alive who met him, and I think he's dead as well. Fast forward a few years, 2003, I've moved to New York to get my PhD, and I'm getting better at emailing at this point, and I send out a bunch of emails to art historians in Paris saying, do you know anything about this dead French painter, Joran Kazak, leaving my phone number. I'm totally broke. I'm in grad school. I'm in my studio apartment in Brooklyn where the shower is like 1 drop of water. There's an old telephone because there's no cell phones yet. And the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's this raspy French accented voice saying, this is Joran Kazak, I'm alive, come to Paris. I have many stories to tell you about Jimmy. So this was 2003, and that was the beginning of what began as an effort to bring Little Man back into print, which for complicated reasons took a long time, but it eventually happened in 2018. And also, I went over there in 2003 and interviewed him for a couple of years. I'd go back and forth before he died in 2005. But what I discovered in my interviews with him was they weren't just collaborators. They weren't just great friends. Baldwin dedicated the love story, the novel, If Beale Street Could Talk to Him. And he was also Baldwin's last great love, but he was married to a woman, and Baldwin became the godson to his father. So it was this sort of complicated relationship that you can also see crop up in many of his novels. So over the course, that's how it all began. At the time, the biographer Judith Thurman, who was friends with the Kazaks, said, you should write a biography of James Baldwin. And I said, absolutely not. No way, I'll never do that. And then 15 years later, through other convolutions of experience, I finally decided that I would try.
So this revelation of Joran Kazak and the importance in Baldwin's life, this was one of the great, things that you brought to light in your book. This is a really important aspect of his life that I think worded, as you said, like 2 paragraphs previously. Was it discovering that late life relationship that inspired you to structure the book around his loves, which really was an innovative way of looking at his life and his work?
Absolutely. So the book is structured in 4 parts. It tells his whole life story, but it's told through his 4 great loves. And these loves can be romantic, they can also be platonic, they can be complicated. All 4 of them are complicated. So the first one is Buford Delaney, the really important African-American painter who Baldwin met when he was 16. And when he was working at a sweatshop after school, and he went to his studio, and he goes, a friend knew in common told him to go there. He climbs up the tenement, he knocks on the door. And remember, Baldwin's growing up impoverished in a very religious household where books and art are not allowed. Opens the door, and there is Buford Delaney, a short brown man with large eyes like him. And behind him are these easels with sheets over them. And he pulls them off, and there are these beautiful paintings of jazz musicians, right? And Buford takes him backstage to meet Marian Anderson. Buford introduces him to blues and to jazz, things he wasn't allowed to listen to. He taught him how to see the world as an artist. There's this famous story that Baldwin tells about walking down Broadway with Buford, and Buford points down at a gutter and says, "Look, what do you see?" And Baldwin says, "I see a gutter." And he says, "Look again." And he sees floating on sort of the surface of the water, like mercury, the buildings around them are being reflected back into something beautiful. So this was a moment when he was learning like how to see the world as an artist. This was a love story. Buford fell in love with Baldwin, but Baldwin sort of assigned him this spiritual father role that went throughout their entire lives, all the way till Buford's death. It was Buford who had actually introduced in Paris in 1959 Baldwin to Joran Kazak. Okay? So you have the kind of bookends of the book. And in the middle, you have these other two major figures. Lucien Happersberger. Baldwin moves to France and falls in love with a young Swissman who changes his life. He takes him to his family chalet in Switzerland where he writes his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, and sort of falls in love. And Baldwin ends up dedicating Giovanni's Room to him, right? And they have this relationship. Lucien also marries a woman and has a child with her, and it's this complicated relationship, love triangle. Baldwin went for that. We can talk about why. And then the next figure is Engin Cazar. Baldwin had this crush on this very famous Turkish actor who played Giovanni in an actor's studio rendition of Giovanni's Room in Greenwich Village, and he followed him in 1961 to Istanbul. People don't know this, but Baldwin called Istanbul his home for the entirety of the 60s. When he was coming back for the March on Washington, Selma, all the civil rights activities, he was actually living in Istanbul. That's where he finished Another Country. That's where he wrote The Fire Next Time. We can talk more about it, but he had to get to these other places, France, Istanbul, in order to have the perspective, as he put it, to write about America and the social ills of the time. And then the last figure is Joran Kazak, who becomes Baldwin's last great love, his collaborator in the 1970s when Baldwin has moved to a farmhouse in the south of France.
So I do want to talk a little bit about this, what it was that he got by moving abroad, like what that was. But I did want to ask a little bit, because it is notable in the book, all of the relationships that he have. There's sort of this unrequited halfway, I found myself reading the book and trying to maybe parse the relationships through a very binary kind of a way, and that was not, it's very resistant to that. So what was it that he was looking for? Because it is very interesting. The men that he fell in love with were married to women, as you mentioned, had children, and yet they had these bonds that lasted for decades. What do we take away from that?
Well, there's a lot to unpack, and the book does that. But one thing that I will say is that Baldwin was drawn to these outsiders. All of these men were outsiders, and they said they kind of rejected, as Baldwin did, all categories, all social impositions. They were wild men and hedonists in some way, and artists, and Baldwin was very drawn to that. I also believe Baldwin had a very complicated journey to self-love. He grew up being told that he was frog-eyed by his father, that he was a sissy, that he was the ugliest boy he'd ever seen. I actually begin the book with Baldwin seeing Bette Davis on screen and recognizing that her eyes are like his mother's eyes, are like his eyes, and that actually he is beautiful, or could be, and she is. But it means that his journey to self-love was very complicated. So he was drawn to these men. And what I show in the book is that these were authentic bonds, but some part of Baldwin was also drawn to this impossible love, the love where these huge breakups would happen, right? And then Baldwin could write with yearning from far away and turn it into art, right? He could write from Paris, about the lost love and turn it into Giovanni's Room. But also, very, very importantly, because this is not a salacious book. This is not a book that's like looking at his love life for gossip, although there's some gossip, but that's not the focus. Because the reality is that Baldwin's love affair with America was an impossible love. Mm-hmm. This was a country that rejected him as a black man. This was a country that rejected him as a queer man, however you want to describe it. And he was constantly breaking up with America and getting back together. He called himself a transatlantic commuter. He'd go back and forth. So it was very creatively productive for him to have these dynamic, complicated relationships that enabled intense connection, drama, and then like bursts of creativity and insight.
And so tell us a little bit more about that. So he was in Paris as a young man. Then he was in Istanbul. He was in the south of France. He was in Switzerland, of course. So tell us, what was it about being away from America and going to these places, like the village in Switzerland where the people had never seen a black person before. And yet he grew as an outsider to love these places with his entire heart. What was it about being an expat that allowed him to produce this quintessentially American literature and to really expose this black American experience to the rest of America and the rest of the world? What was that tension?
There's so much that goes into it. Part of it, I think, is that he always felt like an outsider, sort of as a strange child, as he put it. He felt like an outsider in his own community. He created art out of that outsiderness already when he was writing as a child. Remember, he's a voracious reader as a kid. He read the whole Bible when he was 4, read his way through the Harlem Library by the time he was 8. I mean, I could go on and on, was reading A Tale of Two Cities when he was 10. I mean, so he was an outsider who saw himself reflected back in these books, right? That's how he felt, that he belonged to the world and that the whole world belonged to him. He left for France because his best friend had jumped off the George Washington Bridge to his death. He himself felt that he was going to be the victim of violence, and he thought that he was next. But he also felt that going to France and being alienated from his own people and his own language was creatively productive, because it wasn't until, as you said, he went to Switzerland, to like the Swiss Alps with Lucian, only black person for miles. He wrote an extraordinary essay about it, Stranger in the Village. But it was there he brought Bessie Smith records with him. It was there, listening to Bessie Smith, that he reconnected with the language of his childhood, and that's how he found the voice for Go Tell It on the Mountain. It was climbing the mountain that he came up with the title. When he went to Turkey, just to give another example, that's where he realized, he would say, it's from another place, right, that I have the perspective to write back about America, right? And that he felt actually most American when he was in Europe, right? He connected, not most black American, he felt most black American when he was back in America, but he felt most American in Europe. And he rejected these labels, like as he would put it, he didn't want to be just a Negro writer. He wanted to be an American writer. And that doesn't mean that he wasn't proud of black culture and close to black people, but he rejected these kinds of categories. He rejected male-female, he rejected black-white, gay-straight. So, this outsider temperament was something that fueled him, especially in these locations abroad.
So that's a great segue, because I would like to ask you about his novel, Giovanni's Room, which was published in 1956. So this is the story of a love affair between an American man living in Paris and his Italian lover, whose name is Giovanni. And the book was very controversial at the time, as we would imagine, but what is also true is that simultaneously it was hailed as a literary triumph. I mean, incredible reviews about the power of his writing, about the characterization, about the transcendence of this novel. And what's interesting is we have this black American writer whose first book, Go Tell It on the Mountain, is about his experience, the black American experience. And the protagonists of this book are two white men.
That's right.
So what was it that Baldwin was trying to say or do in his work and his life by making that choice?
Great question. It's actually the 70th anniversary this year of the publication of Giovanni's Room, so it's nice to talk about it. That novel would not, so he wrote Go Tell Them Out, which was very well received, but his publisher Knopf wanted him to keep writing, right, these sort of Harlem novels. And he was never going to be in anybody's box, as he put it. This was the novel that he wanted to write. He actually went to the artist's residency of Yaddo, and he was going through a massive breakup with Lucian and ran up a $300 phone bill, talking on the phone during the breakup. But it was at Yaddo that he realized that this short story that he didn't like was actually a novel. And there are letters where he writes about the moment where he realizes, oh no, Giovanni's Room is not a short story, it's a novel. And it was coming out of this breakup. Baldwin said that he could not have handled the, quote, and these are his words, the homosexual issue and the the race issue in the same novel at that time. Later in his life, he will have black queer characters or black bisexual characters. But at that moment, he said he couldn't do it. And he also felt that he needed a kind of coming out narrative because he wanted to say to people, I'm telling you, you didn't tell me. Because as a black man, a queer man, if you want to call him that, he was especially susceptible to those kinds of phobias when he would come back to the States. And he was also concerned about his family and stuff. So this was his way of kind of coming out. But also importantly, people say it's a book, yes, it's a book about actually an Italian man and a white American man in love in Paris. But it also is a book about race because it's a book about the problems of white masculinity, the problems of whiteness as a social construct. Baldwin writes a lot about this concept of innocence and how white Americans are invested at that time, still, in this notion of false innocence, right? Where if you weren't directly involved with the slave trade or something, somehow you haven't benefited from its after effects. Somehow it's not still living with us. He didn't believe this. He didn't think anybody was innocent for that matter. But he really believed that white Americans had to come to terms with the reality of this country's history and the role of the slave trade and all kinds of other things, right? Discrimination in it. So the novel was actually looking at the character David's closetedness, but also his inability to kind of come to terms with the prerogatives and the privileges that came with white manhood, which is part of why he didn't want to come out. He didn't want to give up what it meant to be a kind of white, privileged, heterosexual man in the world. So Baldwin was still telling us something about race by writing through these white characters.
Now, what do you think he would think today? Because this is a constant topic of conversation about representation, about who is allowed to write what stories. What do you think Baldwin would, what would he inject into that conversation that we're having today?
Well, despite having written a 700-page book about him, I never try to speak for Baldwin. But you can look at the fact that he was supporting Bill Styron writing The Confessions of Nat Turner, which actually I think was a problematic book. But Baldwin supported him in that. Baldwin believed that literature was a place that connects everybody. That's what he said. That's what he realized, right? Reading Shakespeare made him realize he was connected to everybody in the world. And when I used to teach in the university, I would teach Giovanni's Room, and on the back cover would be sort of Baldwin's photo, and the students would be very confused that a black author had written this narrative that doesn't have any black characters. But I think that's instructive, I also think that Baldwin would probably say, more white people need to be reading African American literature. So I would say more white people need to be reading Baldwin because he was writing to both. I mean, think about The Fire Next Time. This is a book, 1962 in the New Yorker, this landed him on the cover of Time magazine. This is where he was telling to white and black Americans that they had to come together like lovers, metaphorically, to truly see each other, deal with this false innocence, and change the world.
So now I want to talk about a little bit of literary controversy, which is, we love. Pretty famously, James Baldwin had a conflict with Richard Wright, another extremely well-known black American writer. And essentially what happened is James Baldwin threw Richard Wright and his novel, Native Son, under the bus, along with Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, and a 1949 essay called Everybody's Protest Novel. And the gist of his argument in this essay is that books like those two novels were simply scaffolding for a political point of view, and they failed in terms of art for art's sake, in terms of being able to stand on their own as high literature. And this is something that he really tried to take Richard Wright to the woodshed, and there's this, amazing scene of Richard Wright and James Baldwin getting into a physical fight with the novelist Chester Himes, breaking it up. I mean, it's like very Instagrammable, and thank God there was no Instagram back then, so we can imagine it, which is much better. But at the end of his life, it's James Baldwin who becomes, one of our most iconic representatives of the artist as activist, of the artist using their work and their message to change social conditions. So what was the arc that took James Baldwin from art for art's sake and really disparaging the work of Richard Wright to becoming somebody who is the embodiment of the artist as activist?
Well, that's such a great question. There's so much to say. So I want to give a little bit of a backstory for those of you who haven't read the book or aren't familiar. So Baldwin moved to Greenwich Village when he was a teenager. He's working in a restaurant, and a friend tells him, I know Richard Wright, go out and see him. Now, Richard Wright is the most famous black writer in the world at that point, the author of Native Son, which was a #1 book of the month club, the first black writer to get that. That was a big deal back then. So Baldwin's very nervous. He takes the train out to Brooklyn, and he meets Richard Wright. Richard Wright's wife and kid are in the back, and Wright comes out with some bourbon, and he asks him what he's working on. And Baldwin is so nervous, and he's drinking the bourbon so quickly, that he makes up this entire story about this novel that he's written that he hasn't in fact written. Wright is like, oh, wow, that's interesting. Can I see it? And Baldwin's like, sure. So Baldwin goes back to Manhattan, sort of quits his job at the restaurant, writes around the clock, which he often did, gets the 60 pages, and actually Wright liked it, and Wright helped him get a grant from a publisher and a first look that didn't pan out, but it was a really big moment. And then Wright went to France, Baldwin followed him there. Wright was very nice to him in the beginning. I want to get to Baldwin's arc later in his career, but I want to talk about this breakup that he had with Wright, because this is sort of my point in the book, that Baldwin needed these breakups, whether they were romantic, erotic, more paternal in this case, in order to create his art. So remember, Baldwin's not finished his first novel. He's going to go to Switzerland. He finds the title but not the voice. He comes back from Switzerland. What does he do? He writes everybody's protest novel. He takes down Richard Wright and says, someday somebody's going to come along who's going to write like real black characters, real human characters, not these Native Son figures that write, who lack humanity. He was talking about himself. So he writes that essay, and then he goes off to Switzerland, and he finds the voice, listening to Bessie Smith, and he writes the novel. So that's what I mean by these kinds of fractious breakups were creatively productive. Now, Wright was not very happy about this when he published this essay.
Needless to say.
He published another one. And I personally believe that these essays were actually unfair to Wright. I think Wright is actually an incredible literary artist. His memoir, Black Boy, is one of the great American memoirs. Native Son itself is so historically important. However, he was also kind of a homophobe, and there are letters between Wright and Ralph Ellison saying not so nice things about Baldwin. So there's also that kind of underlying aspect to their breakup. They never came back together. To their death, Wright was saying cruel things about Baldwin, and Baldwin sort of said, "Oh, I wish I hadn't done that," but didn't really apologize. But you're right. Ironically, by the time the late 60s roll around, Baldwin has become more progressive. It was actually his trip to the South in 1957 for the first time. He met Martin Luther King, and he realized the importance of the civil rights movement, the importance of the black church, which he had also left as a place of political mobilization. And meeting Malcolm X galvanized him even more. So Baldwin was moving further to the left. And his writing was becoming more political, in a way, because it should have been, because the civil rights gains were not happening at the pace that they should have, and he knew it. He had a play on Broadway, Blues for Mr. Charlie, which was called very polemical. But even his novel, which is a love story, If Beale Street Could Talk, people also were calling that kind of like protest literature. I don't believe that his later literature actually was. I believe that for a combination of factors, racism, homophobia, also white liberals not happy that he was becoming further left, he was rejected. And he was later rejected by a younger generation of black writers like Eldridge Cleaver and Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka came back around later. But he was sort of caught in this difficult place. People were calling him passé. But one of the things that a lot of scholars, Baldwin scholars, have explored, but I also try to show in this book, is how Baldwin was actually going strong in his later years. He died too young, but he was working on a number of important books in his later decades.
So what I'd like to do now is turn to you as a writer, writing about a writer, and what it took, I mean, so you've been working on this book for decades at this point. And as we know, it takes a real leap of faith to finish a book. It's lonely, it's, and all of this, it's so fascinating because we see James Baldwin, unable to find his voice, unable to find the solitude, the place where he's going to create. He's got lots of friends. He spends a lot of time with his friends, hanging out until, midnight, and then he writes from like 1 o'clock in the morning until the sun comes up. This writing life is such a strange thing. How did you, talk to us a little bit about the nuts and bolts of putting together this book and how you were able to stay the course and produce this, this extraordinary work of literature?
Insanity. I mean, but Toni Morrison has that line about you have to write the book that you want to read that hasn't been written. And I never thought of that, but when I finished it, I was like, oh, wait, this is actually, well, I knew that I wanted to write the book. When I emailed David Leeming and wanted to know more about Joran Kazak, I wanted to know about these gaps in Baldwin's life, these relationships that sustained him, that I wanted to know what these people meant to him. Who Baldwin saved people's lives, but who saved his life? And so that was the book that was sort of unconsciously in my head. But I mean, I would do crazy things like I'd go to artist residencies and I'd pack up my pickup truck. And most writers go with their laptops, but I would show up with all these archives because I don't do anything digital. So 20 years of archives. My first interview with Joran Kazak, I printed it out. Boxes and boxes, all my books from college even, where I'd underline things. So I'd get there and everyone thought I was a visual artist because I had so much stuff. But in fact, and I'm sure you've done this too, but I would spend the first couple of weeks not writing at all. I would just be storyboarding and moving archives, moving things around and figuring, and I looked like a madman. And I thought, God, but what happened is basically, in a nutshell, once I started writing it, I wrote book 1, Buford. This was during the pandemic, and it was not good. It really, I knew, I just knew it wasn't good. And it was like 100 pages, and it just wasn't good. And so I was supposed to turn it into my editor. I had a very high-profile editor, so I was very nervous. And so I said, okay, let me just write the beginning of book 2, just like the first 2 pages, just so I feel better about this. And so book 1 is really about Baldwin struggling to find his voice as a writer. This is before he gets to Paris. And book 2 begins when he arrives in Paris and falls in love with Lucien Happersberger. As soon as I started writing that scene in this gay bar where Baldwin's telling a story and their eyes lock, I found the voice for the book. And it wasn't easy after that, but I knew I could sort of just write the rest of the book. It took labor, but I wasn't anxious because I kind of knew I could do it. So then I had to go back at the end of the book and rewrite all of book 1, Buford. So, it was sort of this weird thing where I began organically with the end of the book, went to the beginning of the book, and then found the voice sort of in the middle of the book.
And one of the themes that comes out in the book with Baldwin is this balance always between the solitude that's required to produce the book and come up with the ideas and be alone with yourself and to put those words on the page. And then when the book is out, you've got to go and represent the book. And you've got to travel, and you've got to go to the book festivals. And so how do you feel? I'm just interested in you've just made the transition from this very long period of time of incubating this book, and now it's out in the world and it belongs to the rest of us, and we get to enjoy talking to you. But do you think a lot about Baldwin's experience and some of the things that he has said as you are going through the very same thing now?
Baldwin experienced intense postpartum when he finished the books. He wrote about writing as giving childbirth again and again and again. When I finished the book, I was so happy. I was so relieved. And also, when I finished the book, I was at a residency in Key West, and Baldwin died, unfortunately, of esophageal cancer. And as I'm writing the death scene, what do I come down with? But a terrible throat ailment as I'm writing the book. So I was also just glad to be done so I could have my health back. But it's been amazing to come. I mean, this is my only book, you guys, because it took me my whole life. To be at these festivals and to see, there's this whole story that nobody's reading. And I've been going to these festivals across this country, and there are all these readers. And I'm just so grateful for you guys. And I'm also so grateful I get to be in conversation with heroes of mine, like you, like Amani Perry, like Eddie Glaude. Like it's actually thrilling. That part of it is real. It's exhausting a little bit, but it's also really thrilling because what you said is true. Baldwin belongs to everyone, you know, he belongs to the world. And he's somebody that we should all be talking about now in all kinds of different venues. So it's actually quite thrilling, that part of this journey.
That's great. Now, I don't know how our time is. I want to make sure that I leave time for audience questions. We have 20 minutes left? Okay, so then what I'd like to do then is turn it over to the audience and see if there are questions for Nick. Yes.
Thank you so much.
If you could maybe stand up and yes.
And do a dance. No.
My question is, does Baldwin's story teach us that we have to suffer for our art?
Good one, and I haven't gotten that one yet. That's a good one.
The Baldwin, sorry, you
Yeah.
you repeat. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. The question is, does Baldwin's story tell us that we need to suffer for our art?
Well, first of all, I think who knows what he would say, but he'd probably say, we're already all suffering. But I would say that, that's good. I don't think he would prescribe to anybody that they had to suffer for their art, but he had that saying, the price of the ticket, right? That was the title of his collected essays, that there's a price that everybody pays. And like white Americans, for example, who don't come to terms with their whiteness are paying a heavy price for that, actually, because they're shutting something off about themselves, right, that they need to explore. Somebody who's in the closet in a certain way is also doing the same thing. I think that Baldwin believes that we are all suffering, like I said, so it's really whether you're going to create the art out of that suffering. So, but people write out of, my partner does not write out of suffering. Like I write in silence, I need complete silence, my partner likes jubilant, happy music, you know what I mean? Margot, how do you write? Do you write out of suffering?
I write out of suffering between 12 at night and 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, I didn't know. That's very Baldwin. That's very Baldwin.
Yeah.
Are you drinking bourbon the whole time?
No, I'm hoping my son won't wake up in the middle of the night. But I like to, but that's, everybody's got their different thing. That's when the muse is free for whatever reason.
So I can't speak for him. I can't speak for what he would say for others, but absolutely he did. There's no way. He did write out of a certain amount of suffering, but he also wrote out of a certain amount of joy. One of the things in the book that I really wanted to focus on, there's 2 narratives sort of Baldwin. They're dominant. And one is civil rights icon, the orator. You can see him on Instagram. Wow, so magnetic. And then there's another version of him, which is this sad, tragic figure who was in artistic decline, who didn't find great love. And all of my interviews with people who knew him, and I did a lot, counteract that. They were all about the laughter they had. Listen, they were hanging out in the South, their friends with Miles Davis and Toni Morrison, Josephine Baker coming by. I mean, Baldwin had a lot of love and a lot of community in his life and a lot of joy. So this idea, that he was always suffering in this tragic narrative, I think is something we have to really push against. We see this a lot with black artists, that they're talked about that way. Think of Billie Holiday, right? People say, oh, the source of her genius was her suffering. The source of her genius was her addiction. And that's not true. I mean, the source of Baldwin's genius, in my opinion, having done all this research, was, obviously just gifted with language, but he was also just so gifted at connecting with other people, right? Joyfully, as well as in these very serious ways.
Yes.
Here's an open-ended question for you. What do you think he would make of today's political and social situation? Do you think he would be appalled that we're back where we were, or would he see we're in a different kind of place? Curious.
Did everyone hear the question? Yeah, so the question is, what would Baldwin think about today's political situation? And would he think that, basically that we advanced or that we had gone back? Are we in a different place? What would Baldwin think about today?
I would direct you to the excellent Eddie Glaude on that question, who's written a terrific book, Begin Again, and has another one coming out. I personally don't feel comfortable speaking for him. I mean, part of what I wanted to do in this book was set the stage, go to all the places, like turn these stories, like create the places where he was and let his writing, let his words, let his letters speak on their own. But I will say this, I do think there's a lot to learn. We forget that Baldwin was with us until 1987, so like not that long ago, right? And that, because people tend to think the civil rights movement is all in black and white photographs and it happened forever ago, and it really was not that long ago. And that's why the issues are so with us. I would instead say that we should look at what he was writing later in his life, because Reagan was president. He was writing about that in very interesting ways. He was writing, his sort of infamous last book was The Evidence of Things Not Seen, about the child Atlanta murders. And people say it was an uneven book, and in many ways it was. But also Baldwin was writing about race in this new way that wasn't, that we're still dealing with now. So Elizabeth Alexander has written about how black children are growing up now with their phones. We all are, but in particular children, phones where black suffering is just at their fingertips, right? They can see their friends or people who look like them being shot, being harassed, being killed. And Baldwin, when he went down to Atlanta after these child murders were happening, he realized that some shift was happening, that in the popular culture, it used to be you wouldn't really see images of black people, to now there was a saturation through this case of images of black criminality, which we now experienced in our generation. And with these phones, that saturation has reached a new catastrophic level, in my opinion. So I think we could think about what would Baldwin be saying. What would he be saying? Well, we can look at that book to see what he'd be saying. Secondly, and this is one of the things I admire about Baldwin, was he was really willing to change his mind about various issues, which I think people in this country could get better at. I mean, they should all change their mind, to my opinion, but there should also just be more dialogue, real dialogue. And Baldwin was willing to talk to these white racists. I mean, he would sit down in a bar and talk to them. Partially, he wanted to know what made them tick, and that was why he was able to write about white people so well. But also, he really was insatiably interested in the human condition. He changed his mind about the civil rights movement. He really realized that things had to go further to the left. He was much closer to Malcolm X by later in his career. But he also really changed his mind about gender. In the 60s, Baldwin was saying some kind of messed up things to Nikki Giovanni and Audre Lorde, sort of posturing, these macho posturing that he was doing. One of his last essays for Playboy, actually, was actually saying, these are his words, that we are all androgynous. Each contains the other. Male and female and male, black and white and black. And, that's kind of where we're going now in these debates around sort of non-binary identities or trans identities, right? The Black Lives Matters is also Black Queer Lives Matters, Black Trans Lives Matters. So Baldwin was really on the cusp then, in his last decade, of where we are now. So we don't have to imagine, I think, what he would have written. I think he was writing it.
Yes.
Thanks. It's not like there were a whole lot of prominent queer literary figures in America or even in the Western world when he was sort of writing at his peak, yet he didn't seem to get along with any of them. Is that sort of part of that distancing thing that you've already mentioned? Or, I mean, just why didn't he get along with Capote and Vidal and everybody else who might have?
Would you get along with Capote and Vidal?
So if you could repeat the question.
As a Southern queer man, I
Yeah.
kind of have a soft spot
Yeah.
for Truman Capote.
Yeah. Fair.
But in Gore Vidal, no.
He's asking why Baldwin didn't get along with more, I think, American gay writers, essentially queer writers. That's a very good question, and I think it's actually a fair question. But I would also say that his whole world was very queer. I mean, Buford Delaney was his mentor and spiritual father. Bernard Hassel, who was this dancer who was basically his caretaker in the south of France. I mean, he was surrounded by gay and queer people. He didn't surround himself with writers that much. He preferred to be around artists and musicians, He was with Norman Mailer, and then they had a falling out. He'd have falling outs with these people. But what you do key on, which I think is important, is that Baldwin left the States to escape these multiple oppressions. But he did believe that the civil rights cause was the cause of his generation, and this was the one that he was committed to. But and I think this is really important, he understood, one of the reasons he was so important as a writer is he understood that the search for racial justice involved sexuality, not just queer sexuality, but in fact, racism in this country is refracted through an obsession, white obsession with black sexuality. That's why you have the lynchings. That's why you have miscegenation is illegal, and yet you have the enslaver violating that rule. So Baldwin understood that sexuality was at the heart of how racism actually functions in this country. So his insights as a queer man were being marshaled in that direction. But he also, he said late in his life, the word gay wouldn't have meant anything to his lovers. And the reality is, this was true. His lovers were really pretty much straight, and Baldwin is this kind of exceptional figure, and that's part of why it didn't work out. But listen, Baldwin went to Fire Island, and he would write these letters back about, these people. But then he also really hit it off. He walked on the beach once with Frank O'Hara and had a wonderful conversation. So I think your question is fair, but I also think that he just was not part of the gay liberation movement in the States. He also was not part of the feminist movement. However, he changed his mind. Later in his life, he was writing much more about his childhood experiences, queer experiences. And later in his life, he was championing the works of Toni Morrison, Gail Jones, other black women writers in particular. He learned the lesson from the breakup with Richard Wright, this stupid idea that there could only be one famous black writer. Baldwin wanted to proliferate opportunities for black writers who were younger than him.
Do we have time for maybe 2 more questions? I think. Yes.
Hi, James Baldwin's my favorite author, and I love your book, and it just gave me so much more appreciation for his work. I just love it so much. You've got a galley, even.
I don't know what that means. My friend at the bookshop gave it to me.
Yep, that's a galley.
Sure.
Collector's edition. Hold on to it.
I will. And I also loved how long the book was. I was dreading it a little bit at first, but once you get into it, like you said, I was totally roped in. But I feel like whenever I read a biography, no matter how long it is, you got to leave out some parts of their life. So I guess I'm wondering if there are any parts of Baldwin's story that you left out that you might want to share outside of the book.
I left out a lot. I mean, the wonderful thing, and you've probably had this experience with your book, Hidden Figures, and your current book in different ways. I'd be curious. But, when you're writing about so-called marginalized figures, whether they're black figures or queer figures, the archives, can be a problem because you have to find material that's been erased or put aside. In Baldwin's case, the archives are massive at the Schomburg and at the Beinecke. It's almost too much information, right? So there's a ton of stuff that I left out. I could give examples. Mary Painter in the book is really interesting. His best friend, who he writes these extraordinary letters to, a white woman economist who he met in Paris. He kind of fell in love with her, but he said, if I can't marry her, I can marry no one. And she kind of fell in love with him. She was part of the Marshall Plan and all this stuff. I think she might have been part of the CIA. And that actually, if this was a movie, a fictional movie, they fell in love, and she was actually supposed to be kind of tracking him the way that the FBI later did, but then fell in love with him, and it destroyed her life, and she drank herself to death, which in fact she did. I don't know if that's the case. That's completely speculative, but that's my point, is that there are definitely, and the thing is, there's so many amazing Baldwin scholars. Peniel Joseph, who teaches at Emory, is writing a book about Baldwin now. There's a lot more to be written about Baldwin. But, for me, some people have asked me sort of a similar question, which is is there anything that you would want to ask James Baldwin or know about James Baldwin to put in your book? And my answer is, first, no, because this whole book was inspired by a gap in knowledge. And this whole book was constructed intricately to fill in those gaps, in part by writing around them. And for him to tell me things would puncture the entire reason and way that I wrote this book. And I really wrote the book I wanted to write, and I'm happy with it. And so I'd be like, don't tell me anything about nothing, yeah.
Okay, let's see. One more. Can we do one more question? Okay, one more question. Yes.
So who has the James Baldwin mantle today? Is it Ta-Nehisi Coates? Does someone have that mantle today?
I reject that question.
So repeat, if you could just
Oh,
repeat
he
the
asked who
question.
has
Yeah.
the mantle of James Baldwin now, you right? And I
Great
reject
question.
that question because I think it's a fair, I mean, it's that question gets asked all the time, so, you know, it's all good. But it partakes in that logic, I believe, that there can only be one, right? There can only be one great voice of Black America. And the reality is there are so many now. You know, there are women in particular, Tressie McMillan Cottom, for example, right? Yes, Coates is amazing. Eddie Glaude is there. There are younger writers like Dante Stewart writes beautifully about Baldwin. It's really so much more of a conversation happening now among Black writers and white writers and Latinx writers. It's a much more robust interracial and intraracial kind of conversations that are happening, thank God, because that's what we need. We don't need saints. We don't need singular voices. We need collaboration. We need conversation.
Well, I think that is going to do us. So Nick, thank you so much for a great conversation. So I just wanted to let everyone know that you will have the chance to purchase a book and have it signed. Our book signing table, I think, are we, okay, this direction behind us over here. And we would also like you to know that registered festival participants will receive an email with a survey. The staff considers audience feedback. This is your chance to give suggestions, improvements, things that work, that didn't work. So please do answer the questionnaires. That will help for planning future events. And let's see, finally, is there, I don't know if there's a panel after that, but after this here. But if so, you know, I guess we're going to clear the room, sign books, and then if there's a next panel, it'll begin shortly. So again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you.